So you've got a problem. You want to play a tense strategic worker placement game, but all the good ones only play 4 people, and you just have too many friends. Well, not to worry. Dune Imperium Uprising has a thruple-based 6-player mode that I've been playing a ton of and wanted to talk about. Dune Imperium is already a tight squeeze. 4 players is super crowded, like smushing 4 people into a coop. There's just enough space for everyone to ride, but there's not much space between people, so it keeps the tension high. And that's a huge reason why it's so good. But squeezing 6 people into the same space would make for a miserable time. So Dune Imperium Uprising makes pretty chunky modifications to get 6 players working. The game is larger, but is bigger really better, or does it all amount to unnecessary bloat? So to get it all working, you start off by flipping over the board, revealing the big board, with some new spaces, modified spaces, and the return of some classics like Carthage. You add on the commander boards representing the exclusive Emperor and Fremen tracks, which are just for those 2 players. You add on tokens and the board stuff as per usual, you make the decks as per usual. Just note that there are 6 alliances now, but 2 are replaced by the Fringe Worlds and the Great Houses, as the Fremen and Emperor have been moved to the commanders. You create the conflict deck, but remove the tier 1 card, and you hand out all your starting decks and normal pieces as per usual in the 4-player game mode, and those 4 players are known as the allies. You give the commanders a special unique deck and special tokens, place the score markers, 1 for the allies, 4 for the commanders. You draw out the objectives, but ensure that each team gets 1 desert mouse and 1 crysknife. And that's pretty much it. The rest of the game is all set up as per normal. That said, some of the gameplay differences are pretty hefty. The most dramatic change in the 6-player game mode is that the game is now a team-based 3v3, with 2 players leading the charge as commanders, and the entire feel is more reminiscent of a game of tug-of-war over a jagged cliff. 2 players get thrust into the role of the commanders, while the other 4 players are the allies. Each team has 1 commander and 2 allies, and these commanders sit between their allies and will either be the elderly Emperor Shaddam Corrino or Paul Muad'Dib, who would definitely love you if you turn into a worm. Commanders have a lot of new tools, like powerful starting decks with new ways to score points, new agents that activate the player on their left or right, as well as they have a personal alliance board with spaces they can only visit and a commander-specific ability for their team. With these additions, commanders also have some subtractions. Commanders do not have armies and will share troops and swords with their allies, as well as they do not have influence with the 4 main factions and instead can increase that influence for their allies. What this means is that conflict and many friendship points are not available for commanders. Now, activation is the core mechanical difference of commanders. Unlike allies, commanders have small cardboard agents that have an arrow that activates the ally to their left or right of the commander. The commander will then apply any benefit that isn't applicable to themselves to the activated ally. It almost acts as a half turn for that ally, and also encourages the commander to support both allies when needed. For example, if the commander goes to secrets, that commander player will draw the entry card, but since they have no influence with the Bene Gesserit, the activated ally gains the influence. So what does this all amount to? Playing as one of the 2 commanders will result in a dramatically different game feel and strategy than what you might be used to in the normal 4-player game mode. It does capture the feeling that you're actually leading your allies in their missions and helping them achieve their goals. Since commanders do not score as many points as their allies, as they don't gain points from conflicts or from the normal 4 factions, instead they are a large part of enabling the team's game plan. This means dumping in more troops to swing a combat, or pushing them up an alliance track. Sometimes it feels like your commander is more of a babysitter than a leader, but the true nature of the role is that they are the people who will pick up your defeated corpse and drag you over any finish line, no matter what it takes. Now, this isn't to say commanders don't influence the outcome of the game on an individual level. They can certainly score through points through forging alliances with their unique commander faction board, or by using their deck in some cases to score points, or by achieving other objectives throughout the game. The commander has less total potential to score points, but the points are still extremely valuable. Like I mentioned, since commanders start off the game with 4 points in comparison to the other players who start off at 1 point, it is expected for them to score less points in the same amount of time. And because of this, it creates an interesting dynamic. Some players really focus heavy on enabling their allies, which lets their allies gain as many points as possible, while other commanders focus more on scoring their own personal objectives and less on assisting their allies. It creates an interesting cost-benefit analysis for the commander, and almost feels like you're doing repeated trust falls with your allies. Commanders as a whole are a pretty neat solution to a potential bloating problem. At first I worried that the commander role might not feel as fulfilling as other players, but the role offers a unique puzzle and really glues the team together. The unique decks, the activation of allies, and the other minor rule modifications really nails the feeling of being a commander without overstuffing the game. Uprising's 6-player mode has no treachery, no grand betrayal, and you strictly win or lose together as a team. But like any hierarchical thruple, the dynamics of this team is 2 dyads centered through the commander. What I mean by this is that the interaction between the team is mediated through the commander. The commander is the hub and the 2 other players are spokes, like a human bridge between the 2 other players. The reality is that the 2 allies on each team actually have fairly minimal interaction with each other when it comes to achieving objectives. Interaction comes through by not ruining your allies' objectives, but direct help is fairly minimal. The allies play a game that's very similar to the normal base game, but at the same time they try to be cognizant so that they don't step on each other's toes. For example, some rounds will prelude with a public discussion on each team on which ally might want to go hard and stay hard in the combat, and which ally might be more interested in collecting resources or which influence track they want to move up on. Yes, it's all teamwork, but allies do not interact directly except for a couple of spaces which do allow for troop deployment and a trade of resources. On the other hand, the commanders are the crux of their team, dragging their exhausted allies across each and every grueling point, bumping them up with troops and swords, making sure that they are friendly with all the factions, and keeping the team together. Since the commanders can activate each of their teammates at least once per round, it becomes a bit of a game of trying to figure out what your allies need and trying to figure out how to achieve it. And I like this type of teamwork a lot because it's a game of trade-offs. Does the commander focus on each ally at the same level? Do they focus on themselves? What is the plan for each round? And since commanders are expected to score fewer points, they are incentivized to assist their team. And it's a unique role that presents interesting choices for the commander and for their team. Intelligently, this game scores the total points of the entire team after the endgame phase is completed. So it's not so much a race to 10 points like it might feel in the 4-player game mode, but instead a more communal effort to score as many objectives as possible. And you want to trigger that endgame when you are confident you are going to outscore the other team, even with all those sneaky endgame secrets. And much like any polyamorous relationship, communication is key to keep 3 people happy. And in the rulebook, it is recommended that all discussion between the teams are public. There are no secrets that aren't shared with the opposing team, and this is how I played for the vast majority of our games. It is undoubtedly the preferred way than playing with private information between teams. It's very easy to realize that when groups have the option to disclose private information, there is a lot of piggybacking, which unintuitively reduced the feeling of teamwork. Having one player call the shots without any risk really reduced those moments where you need to trust another player. For example, can your commander go to Highliner? Do they have access? Do they have a way to get enough spice? All of this loses tension when everyone on the team knows exactly what's in each other's hands. On the other hand, requiring only public information increases the tension and actually creates a new strategical choice of whether or not to disclose information. In some games, it's a full-on discussion on what the team game plan is, while the other commander is trying to find counters to that plan. Other times the game is completely quiet and everyone is holding onto their secret plans from the opponents. And it's almost like your commander is trying to read your mind. It's an interesting dynamic because showing your plans might be necessary for success, but can also risk it if the opposing team can counter. Asymmetry is a beautiful thing. When used correctly, it allows for a breadth of gameplay strategies, creativity, and ultimately a new way to think about a game. And in this 6-player variant, it implements asymmetry in a way that's beyond what's found in the 4-player mode. And I have a bit of a problem with it in 6-player Uprising. So in this 6-player version, each of the commanders gets a brand new 10-card deck, which is awesome. It has some overlap, the Signet Rings, the Seek and Allies, Convincing Arguments, but the other cards are amped up and provide a unique twist on the base deck, which is great. I'm a fan. I think both of these decks are flavorful, neat, and balanced. There's nothing wrong here, and I like these decks. It's all good stuff. But here's the part I can't jive with. And it's not even really in the rulebook, but on each of the commander's personal faction boards, there are some bad game designs that force both teams into a very distinct yet stale playstyle. And let's talk about this. The 6-player game mode goes heavy into a lore-accurate duel between the Emperor and Paul, which is great and super neat until you realize you are being forced into one overarching strategy every single game, and it feels painfully stale. With the Muad'Dib team, his board says, when one Muad'Dib ally gains the Maker Hooks, the other ally also gains Maker Hooks. On the Emperor, it says, your team can't gain Maker Hooks. Game start, move a non-Fremen card from the Imperium row to the Throne row. So what's my problem? Well, my problem is that this is forceful and bad reductive asymmetry. These two board-specific blurbs severely limit and simplify the playstyles of each team. In almost every single game, and it doesn't matter who you have as an ally, the Muad'Dib team will rush one ally for Maker Hooks, while the Emperor team will go for those high value cards that he places in the Imperial tent. It creates an overarching game plan even before the game starts. And the first 4 or 5 games, I really enjoyed it because it was cool and thematic and everything worked well. The Emperor using his vast powers to snatch up the most powerful tools, while the Muad'Dib utilizes desert power of the sandworms. It was cool, but then it got stale, and every game started off with each other's team recognizing the strategy of the other team. People would say, we know the Muad'Dib team wants hooks ASAP, and they want to get rid of the shield wall. And the Emperor, we know he wants those high value cards in his Imperial tent for his team. And look, I think the two sides are actually very well balanced. The pros and cons of each side work well, but only if they play into their strengths. It isn't that one team will steamroll the other team. And of course, there are deep and strategic decisions that need to be made to best overall execute these strategies. It's just that it gets predictable in a way that feels detrimental to the long-term enjoyment of this game mode. You know the Muad'Dib team will go for worms every single game, and you know the Emperor's team will go for deck building. Both strategies work well, both are deep, but having the same game plan each and every game gets stale. Put simply, if Muad'Dib's team does not go for the worms, they will be losing huge swing potential. And if the Emperor does not go for those extremely high value cards, they will be hamstrung. Each side is strong and well balanced, but because the team's asymmetry is so powerful, it subtracts from other possible strategies for each side. Of course, selection of allies leaders will change individual playstyle, but the team as a unit will have one overarching plan which can't be neglected. No matter what combination of leaders are in play, the overall plan for each team remains consistent between games. This is frustrating because the use of team asymmetry is the largest problem in the entire game mode. And look, I like asymmetry. Almost all of my favorite games use asymmetry. But instead of asymmetry creating new strategies and new ways to think about the game, the asymmetry of these commander boards force the team down one pathway to victory, and it restricts gameplay decision space. It's frustrating that there are so many limits when you play on either team, and instead of enhancing the game space, it creates a sense of staleness after just a few games. And when you compare these to the actual leader cards in the same game, the leader cards might encourage a certain kind of playstyle, but you can pick a versatile character or go against the obvious gameplay strategy of the character you pick. In this 6-player game, you are forced and restricted into a certain game plan for the whole team. And I get what they're going for. In the future, we can see expansions where there can be new commanders and new boards, like imagine Lady Jessica, who might have her own unique text box on the board. I totally get it, and that's a cool idea, but that's not how the game is structured now. And with just the 2 commanders, with this level of forced asymmetry, it really dampens the variety of the matches. It's easy to imagine in the next expansion there are 4 other leaders, each with their own faction board and with their own flavorful asymmetry. And that's truly what I would need in order to try this game mode again and again. Because the game as it is now is hamstrung by rigidity. And creating more flexible playstyles for the teams would really enhance that experience. To put this differently, some of the very best parts of Uprising are restricted from each team. Often your teammates will feel frustrated that they are forced into a strategy and that they will need to lean into it for victory. It even feels bad for the Emperor's team to go to some spaces because you know you won't be able to get those worms through hooks. And it feels bad having some of the most fun cards just plucked away. It doesn't create a new challenge, it just limits strategies in a way that's ultimately predictable and creates stale, boring games. Yes, it's thematic, yes, it makes sense in the lore, but Uprising was never really about the lore in the first place. You can have the Emperor get worms in the base game, and you can have the Muad'Dib player use Sardaukar. Heck, even Fade can be best friends with the Fremen. The theming is fun, but this game shouldn't be a slave to theme as a consequence of gameplay. Some games meld theme with the gameplay throughout in its entire game design, but Dune Imperium isn't one of those games. It's best when it has tough decisions and moments of tension, and a lot of that decision space is sacrificed in the 6-player game mode for theming. And it's frustrating because all the core mechanics of the 6-player game mode work really great. I don't have a problem with the activation or the spaces or the unique commander decks or any of that. I don't care about how the Swordmaster is different. I have a problem with how these 2 blocks of text absolutely crush strategic diversity and fun. So how can you fix it? Well, let's just cover this up and this, and let's replace this card, and there we go. Viable playstyles in abundance. And I know you think I'm nitpicking, but I very much love that there's a 6-player variant of Dune Imperium. Truly, having 6 people play in this big, complex, often brutal game brings me joy. From the misplays to the mind sinks, the game is good. It's even great. It's just not the thunderous smash that I wanted it to be. And when a game as tightly as put together as Dune Imperium Uprising remixes itself, there has to be some give and take. Uprising adopted a wholly refreshed approach on 6-player worker placement and adds in a thematic approach to gameplay, which strongly encourages each team to play into the story the game is trying to tell. But at the cost of the story, there is a loss of strategic freedom. The lore-accurate storyline the designer is trying to tell takes away from the agency of the players, and it really does force certain playstyles off the table. And the first 2 times I played, I was truly captivated. I wanted to try it all. I wanted to play as the opposing team or play as the commander on both sides and experience the vastness of strategies. But after more and more plays, I've come to realize this game mode has restricted the game diversity that I've had in my 4-player games. And I find myself wanting to play that 4-player game mode instead. The game was less interesting after about half a dozen plays, and I felt myself and others itching to go back to the 4-player game mode just because it felt so much more interesting from game to game. Put simply, our interest in the 4-player mode increased after each playthrough, and our interest diminished after each game of the 6-player game mode. For this reason, I'm giving Dune Imperium Uprising, the 6-player game mode, a 9.6 out of 10 on the first few playthroughs and an 8 out of 10 on repeated playthroughs. Averaging the 2 out, it's an 8.8. It's great, but it doesn't reach stratospheric strategic bliss that the 4-player game mode presents. I see excellent potential for this game mode to hit the highest of highs, but it needs a little bit more. I would start off with new commander boards that allow for more fluid playstyles. And some final thoughts. A lot of my friends love the Dune franchise, And whenever we have a big game night, we want the best experience. If only there was a Dune game out there that really had emphasis on 6 players, that really took asymmetry in a direction that is both lore accurate and encourages creative play. Maybe add in some luck, some interesting combat mechanics, with loads of content. Maybe even capture the backstabbing and betrayal that's so core to the Dune world. I wish that kind of game would really exist. Wouldn't that be a dream? Well, maybe one day.